Been a long day, but I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting speech to close out our very vibrant and informative discussions today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Jan Hamrin. She was the founder and executive director of the Independent Energy Producers Association in the 1980s, which helped to make California a world leader in new renewable development. In 1997, she founded the Center for Resource Solutions, which was created to foster leadership in the implementation of clean energy and sustainable development practices through education, training, and expert assistance. She was instrumental in developing the Green E-Renewable Energy Certification Program. She co-authored Achieving a 33% Renewable Energy Target, which is certainly very relevant to the topic that we just discussed, which provided information on the necessary changes needed to expand renewables to meet Governor Schwarzenegger's greenhouse gas reduction targets. She also performed a pivotal role in the development of China's 2005 Renewable Energy Promotion Law, which is her experience, which is of great interest to us at this meeting. She currently serves as president of the Center for Resource Solutions. In May of this year, she was honored by the California Energy Commission for her outstanding leadership in shaping state, national, and international renewable energy markets. A resolution declared, quote, "The California Energy Commission acknowledges and thanks Dr. Jan Hamrin for her 25 years of exemplary contributions to furthering renewable energy development." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamrin, who will address us on the question, the China Sustainable Energy Renewable Energy Program.
Thank you very much. I am honored and pleased to be here, and I will try to not stand too long between you and dinner. But I'm going to wrap things up today with talking more about how you work in China or in other countries internationally. You've had a rich day of information and input on particular programs and content, but you can be the smartest person in the world, you can have the best data, you can have the answers, but you also somehow need to convey those to other people in order to be effective. So I'm going to focus on that aspect this evening. And some of the lessons learned that I have learned both working in China and that I learned in working internationally in other countries besides China before I went there. So I'll give you the points, and then I'll give you some anecdotes and stories about working in China and my experience there that hopefully will reinforce these points. The first one is you need to be willing to put in time. Most countries, and certainly more so than the United States, people do not do business with someone that's a complete stranger. They like to get to know who they're working with. And often we have international agencies and others that parachute us in to a country. We go in for a day or two, we go in for a conference, and then we leave and they never see us again. And you wonder why they might not have incorporated our brilliant words of wisdom that we work so hard to do in our half-hour speech to the people at that time. So you need to be willing to put in time. Second is you need to listen to what the people you're working with really want. What are the drivers behind what they are seeking and what they are saying? Often we are so busy listening to ourselves and the wonderful, brilliant ideas that we have that we forget to ask the other side, well, why is it that you are going the directions you go, or where is it you actually want to be? What are the drivers behind that? The third item is to keep your work in reasonable bite-sized pieces. Again, especially coming from academia and other places, we love to write tomes. We love to give every little detail we can think of of the policies, of why you'd go this way, of why you don't go that way, and put it all down in one place. But when you think of yourself, most of us are way too busy to read or digest 200 pages or 100 pages of information. And often getting it in bite-sized pieces in time, just in time when it's needed, is a much more effective tool. And the final point I want to make is have patience. So let me give you a little story of how I ended up in China and some of my experience there with the China Sustainable Energy Program. This wasn't planned. My career path, my ideas of professionally what I wanted to do never included China. I speak Spanish. I've lived in Latin America. I've done a lot of work in Europe. I've done a lot of work in Latin and Central America and in Canada. I did not plan on working in China. I don't speak Mandarin. I never studied the Chinese culture. So when I was asked if I would head the renewable energy team for the China Sustainable Energy Program, I said I was extremely flattered, but no, I really did not think that was reasonable. I was already trying to do things in the United States federally with renewable energy, trying to do things in California locally, had been hitting my head against brick walls for many decades, and felt that I probably didn't need to try to do that in China. And so a blonde female from California, I just didn't feel was going to be the most effective person. Nevertheless, the China Sustainable Energy Program continued to push me, and my husband, and I often tell this story, said, well, Jan, given your concerns about the environment, and particularly about climate change, if you don't work with China, the rest of what you do doesn't really matter, does it? Well, I thought that was a really cheap shot. But as for many cheap shots, it also seemed to be true. And so I finally relented and started working in China in 1999 with the Energy Foundation Packard China Sustainable Energy Program, and I'm so glad I did. In many respects, I think I've accomplished more in China than I have in the United States. And during this period of time, that's maybe not too hard to understand. So let me tell you first, the first couple years that I was in China, I would go over, we would do workshops. I know when I walked in the room, people would go, here comes the blonde female from California again. But they were too polite to get up and leave, they had been ordered to attend these meetings, so they were there, and they stayed through. After a couple of years, I think I wore them down. And it was, well, she's not going away. She's back again. So, maybe she has something to offer. By 5 years, we finally had a working relationship. And in fact, when the National People's Congress posted the goal of having a renewable energy law for China, my colleagues in China ran to me and said, Jan, what should we do and how can we do this? What kind of framework should we have? Well, it took a lot to get there from the first day when I walked in and was just completely not credible in the Chinese community to being in a place where I could work closely with my Chinese colleagues in helping them to craft something. I think that and the reason I want to bring this up is that I think that it's Packard and the Energy Foundation together have this China Sustainable Energy Program. And I think it is an excellent model for working in China, for working internationally. And what is it? Well, one, they have 5 teams of experts that work on various things. My colleague and friend, Mark Levine, heads up the energy efficiency team. I head up the renewable energy team. We have several others in electricity restructuring and transportation and so forth. What is it, Mark? 85 or 90% of the funds are spent in China to fund Chinese grantees to work on the issues that they think are important. The international team is there to provide assistance. And this is where it's so important to be listening. What is it that the people you're working with want? So that you can actually give them information when they need it that is useful to them. So basically, our approach is we ask, what is it you want to do? And we will give you information about how other countries, other states, other people have tried to do the same thing, and some of the pros and cons of the different methods that have been tried. Ultimately, it's up to our Chinese colleagues to decide what is best for them and what suits them best. In the renewable energy area, when I first got there, the first couple of years, I would very carefully go through what California's been doing, the United States has been doing, Europe and others, and how successful they've been. And my Chinese colleagues would say, but we do coal. And so we would, again, work on all of the sales pitches for why it would be useful for China to be looking at renewable energy. And they would thank me very much and say, well, but we do coal. And renewable energy is very expensive. Well, as I said, it's important to understand why people do the things they do and what the drivers are. Though China does do coal, and that's a large amount of what they do, one of the big issues, though, is environmental for the people of China. And I'm not talking about our goals, but I'm talking about their goals. I don't have to tell my colleagues in China that you can't breathe the air. My colleagues in Beijing know you can't breathe the air. They have to live there. They have children they're raising there. They see the health statistics. They know the percentage of people that have respiratory ailments, and particularly percentage of children that have respiratory ailments. They know that they are losing somewhere in the neighborhood of 30% of their agricultural productivity because of acid deposition and air pollution. Those are real costs to them. Climate change, in my view, is not such a big issue for China, but everyday pollution is. Acid deposition is. Now, the fortunate thing for us is that in the energy sector, many of the things that you would do to reduce acid deposition, to reduce particulate matter, to reduce air pollution and improve health, also will serve for reducing carbon emissions and lead towards some of our global warming goals. Now, the first, I think, up until 5 years ago or 4 years ago, we couldn't mention climate change in China. It was not acceptable. It was not a topic that Chinese wanted to talk about or one that we would even mention. So there's been a huge change since that time. But I still feel that part of the change is due to the fact that people are starting to see that there is a way that they can achieve what they want to achieve in China, which is better air quality. None of us want our children sick. None of us want our family sick. We don't want premature deaths. We don't want to lose agricultural production. And that, fine, if in the West you want to call it, say it's activities for climate change, and that's what will bring in money and support for the things we want to do, you do that. But I think a major driver still in China is not so much climate change as it is improving air quality, improving quality of life for people who are living there with a very serious environmental problems in both air and water. Energy efficiency, as the last panel told you and Mark told, has gone and become quite successful in China. Special funds have been developed in China for energy efficiency and for renewables. The Renewable Energy Law was amazing, absolutely astounding. So I was in China in, I think, November, I've got to get the years right, I think it was of 2000, and it was passed in 5. So it must have been 2003. And my Chinese colleague said, They've posted, they want a renewable energy law. Let's get working on it. What should the framework be? How can we do this? This was over tea in a break during a conference like this, but we went out to the other room, and on a paper napkin, we started planning out what a framework might look like. What are the kinds of elements you'd want in a renewable energy law? That was November of 2003. 2 entities were appointed to write versions of the renewable energy law, Tsinghua University and NDRC. Those were due into the National People's Congress, or the Standing Committee, by, I think it was the end of June in 2004. I had asked when this first started, well, how soon do you think a renewable energy law might be able to be passed? Somebody looked down and they said, well, the last energy law took 8 years. And I thought, oh, okay, well, we'll plug along and keep at it. So these 2 agencies wrote their versions of what they thought should be in the law. This may be surprising to some of you who haven't spent much time in China. This was one of the most democratic processes I've ever been through. It was fascinating. They came out with a draft, and they invited people to comment on the draft. And we had a workshop, and we had about 150 people attend the workshop. This was the NDRC draft. And they commented, and they, just like anyone else, they had their issues and their concerns. Well, are you going to include photovoltaics? Are you going to include rural development? And how do you include that in the renewable energy law? And so forth. And we went through a whole day of this. And at the end of the day, I met with my Chinese colleagues, and they said, Jan, now how are we going to incorporate all these comments? Now, I've worked in the United States a long time. I've worked in legislatures and in Congress. I've been in a lot of hearings and a lot of places where you have people make comments. I don't know if I've ever had the governmental people responsible say, now how are we going to incorporate the comments? I mean, really, usually it's the reverse. Okay, if we can just ignore all of these or pretend that we're sort of paying attention to those and then just go ahead with what we intended to do from the start. Not how do we incorporate them. And they did. They listened to the comments. We went through, we set criteria, we rejected the ones that were just silly or really weren't relevant to it. We identified the ones that were relevant, and we figured out ways to incorporate those. A final draft was submitted to the Standing Committee, and they said they would review it, and they'd make some changes, and then it would go to the first committee. It has to pass 2 committees. One was the Environmental Committee, and the second was the Legal Committee. And then it has to have a vote from the floor. So it's 3 votes that go for making a law. So in August then, so this is August 2004. First time we talked about this was November 2003. August 2004, the Environmental Committee issued their version of the law. They put the 2 documents together that had been proposed and all of the comments and everything that had been incorporated, and they came out with their version of the law. And again, they sent it out for comment and review. We helped coordinate international comments from countries that were interested in what China was doing and who have been very active with renewable energy. It came to the committee for a vote in December. I had been told it probably wouldn't come to a vote for a year or 2, but it came up in December. There were some minor changes made in the language, and it was passed unanimously by the committee, by the Environmental Committee. Well, that was a shock, so didn't expect that to happen so fast. So now it would go to the Legal Committee. I said, well, how long is that going to take? Well, that could be another year or 2, but we'll see how it goes. It was passed to the Legal Committee. The Legal Committee made some changes, and to my pleasure and to my great pleasure, they strengthened the enforcement for the law and the penalties for noncompliance that we had been pushing for as it had gone along, but hadn't seen that happen. They put it out for comment. It came to a vote at the legal committee in February 2005, and they unanimously passed it. And then the standing committee said, well, there doesn't seem to be any opposition, and there's all this support for it. Let's vote it off the floor. They took it to the floor. It was unanimously approved, and the end of February 2005, the law was passed, having first been started and discussed for the first time in about, well, it was posted, I think, in September and then discussed in November of 2004. I've never seen that kind of speed in the United States or even at the state level. It definitely reflected a desire on the part of the leadership to have something in place and support for that. It became effective in January 1, 2006, and we have since been working on implementation of that law. Pick up my notes because I do need to have a couple of them. So it carved out a new direction. In our first couple years in working in China, we focused on the 5-year plan. There was language in I think the 8th 5-year plan that said, or the 9th 5-year plan that said China would look favorably on renewable energy. Then the next 5-year plan, there was language that said they were going to think about adopting a renewable portfolio standard or some similar kind of program to encourage renewables. Now, in this most recent 5-year plan, they codified the targets that the Renewable Energy Law required the government to develop and put in place of 10% renewable energy by 2010 and 16% by 2020. So it's been a really rapid and interesting evolution during my time in working in China, and very rewarding in seeing the changes taking place. Another of the issues was just capacity building. When we first got there, there were very few people in the government in China who knew much at all about renewable energy, let alone renewable policy, how it's done in different countries, what the options might be for China. So much of what we've done over this past eight years or so has been building capacity, providing information to people that are working in government, working in universities or other related fields about energy policy and renewable energy policy particularly, and what the different options are and what the pros and cons are of some of those. We've also been building relationships, and that continues to be an important part of anybody's work internationally, is to build relationships with people that they trust your judgment, that the things you tell them will be correct. At the same time, you're not trying to tell them what they should do, but trying to help them figure out how they can do and accomplish the things that they are trying to do themselves. Right now, my assessment of renewable energy in China is, to a great extent, we need to get out of their way. I think that things are moving rapidly. There's local manufacturing developing for renewable energy within China, so it's not just importing foreign equipment and foreign designs. We are seeing larger and larger projects being proposed and developed and being completed. I think you will see greater diversity in the types of technologies that are coming into China. And I think that they are on their way. As was mentioned by the last speaker, in order for China to have 16% renewables by 2020, it means a huge growth, as it's not 16% of what they've got now, but with their energy growth going at an exponential rate, you also have to have your renewable energy growth going in the same way in order to reach that kind of target. It's extremely challenging, but I think that we have reached a place where there are knowledgeable people who have ideas and plans and have become quite sophisticated about how to implement those plans. The difficulties and challenges, one of the big challenges was constantly changing decision makers. When you're trying to work on a topic, you have this person who's head of the agency. Whoops, he's gone. Now there's another person there. Whoops, he's gone. They've changed the lower and the upper, and so the people are changing around, and for a while we had people changing at a rapid speed. We had agencies changing. So they were restructuring the energy sector of the Chinese government. So we had entirely different sets of agencies. And then they decided to change those, put some together, and then they decided to split those apart. And it was extremely confusing and difficult. It is difficult to provide assistance when you're not always sure who it is making the decision and who it is that needs the assistance. So training people and building capacity has definitely been an important role, an important thing that has to take place. Having a champion. You need to have a champion within government for the kinds of things that you are trying to help them do. So you may have lower level people who are absolutely committed, who think this is definitely the way to go. And you may even have the very top of the country, leaders, think that's the way to go. But you need a champion within the key agency that is high enough that they can bring that before the other agency heads and other people in government to really make things move ahead. And of course, the ultimate challenge is knowing how hard to push and when to stop and when to get out of the way. And that is, I can't overestimate the importance of that. The impact on China, and these are my concluding remarks on this, and the successes. I just am so pleased with the China Renewable Energy Law. It covers liquid fuels, it covers electricity, it covers photovoltaics and solar water heating, it covers rural development, it includes as well as grid-based central station or large renewable facilities. And as important as anything is, we now have some significant capacity within the various government agencies who can implement this law and who understand the importance of it and are willing to work hard to try to get the results that was intended. And we are continuing ongoing work with China. We constantly have visitors coming here, and we also, because we've developed good rapport and relationship with our Chinese colleagues, we're able to do a lot through email, just like we would do with each other here. So we'll get a question, and that's the way we handle much of the work. Our colleagues will say, we have a question. How did Germany figure out their feed-in tariff? And that means we can write 6 pages or 10 pages, maybe, max. But we will give them the answer and get it back to them within a couple weeks of their asking the question. So they're not waiting for 6 months for us to do our ultimate tome on feed-in tariffs and how they've been calculated every place and all of that. We give them an answer. Then they may come back and say, well, can you elaborate on this point a little more? Can you tell us more about this detail? And then we can provide that to them. And that way, they build up their knowledge a piece at a time, and they get information in the size that they can handle. We are there regularly, several times a year, and meet on a face-to-face basis, and that allows us to continue to also maintain this electronic connection even when we aren't there, that we can exchange information, exchange ideas. My final statement that I want to make about all of this is how valuable this kind of work and proceeding in this way is on my side too, and to the things that we do here in the United States, here in California. It's a two-way learning proposition. It's not just giving information to someone who doesn't have it, but learning how they are approaching a problem, how they view that problem, how they define the problem, and how they are thinking about the options for solving that problem. And I have learned many things from those deliberations in China that I've brought back again here in my work in California or in the United States. So for those of you who haven't worked internationally yet or who haven't worked in China and are hoping to work in China, I strongly encourage you to do so, but be patient and understand that you need to build relationships. You need to listen to what people are saying to understand what the motivations are that are really driving them in certain directions. And to keep your information exchanges in reasonable pieces so people actually have time to read it and digest it. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much, Jan, for sharing your insights and your experiences. That was extremely valuable. I had a couple of questions. One, when you kept referring to your colleagues, who are your colleagues? Are these government officials? Are they scientists? Are they legislators? And when you talked about the floor, you're referring to the National People's Congress and all of that. So first of all, who are your colleagues? Also, I just wanted to make one comment. Also, I guess you've addressed, I had wanted to raise the question of implementation, and it sounds like you really are going and following up to make sure one of the themes of the day is the center-local relationships, the degree to which a lot of these high-minded, high-sounding policies and laws are actually implemented. But I just came back Wednesday, I mentioned this morning, traveling with a delegation from the Bay Area Council, and they signed a $200 million agreement with the Yangtze River Council for a $200 million venture capital fund, a lot of which will be directed towards green tech and environment-related investments, which is, when you mentioned about local manufacturing capacity, I think certainly in the Yangtze River region, this is one thing that they're very seriously focused on. So I'll open the questions with asking about your colleagues, and then we'll open it to the floor.
Okay. My colleagues, pretty much all of the above. We've worked with folks from Tsinghua University and other universities. We work with sort of the government think tanks, which are about as close to a nonprofit, though we are seeing some real nonprofits in China. You have the government think tanks that provide information back up to the official government agencies. We also certainly talk with the government employees themselves, and very often these two are the same. You'll have someone who is a professor from one of the universities who's working for one of the government think tanks, who may also hold a position in government. So the lines get quite blurry as far as exactly which hat someone is wearing at a time, but you have all of those.
Great.
On the implementation side, and then we'll just open it to other questions, China was particularly interested in how to stimulate local manufacturing. And so again, part of the goal is to have renewable energy, but certainly part of the goal is to find other products that might be appropriate for export by China, as well as used domestically. Their goal was not to just import US or Danish or German or Spanish equipment, but to actually get in the job of manufacturing their own things. So we did a number of studies and reports about how other countries had tried to do the same thing, whether it was Spain or it was Germany. There's a good case study in Quebec and various places in the world, and what they've done and how effective that was to stimulate local manufacturing, as well as looking at tax laws, import duties and tariffs, and how that affects the ability to, or the necessity of importing things versus manufacturing them locally. And then, of course, it all ties into, well, how fast can you do this? How fast can you ramp up local manufacturing? And you have to have a market first. Nobody, whether they're in China, the United States, Australia, wherever, is going to invest in manufacturing until they feel confident they have a market. So all of these pieces come back and fit together, and part of our job is helping people see how the pieces fit. Great. So with that, questions?
Questions? One right? There's a, yes, should wait for the mic.
I think it's just a very, very exciting and fabulous speech. Thank you so much for sharing with us your experience. I think you deserve the real credit as well as helping China giving a good hand to speed up that renewable energy law on its passing. I think we shouldn't undervalue your contribution in that whole process. That being said, I'm going to ask you a question from my political science background. You're very patient, and you tell us to be patient, and that's very good. But you also know there are people who are not very patient in the United States. And there are opinion leaders who are saying this is the proposition for you, what you're doing, and others who are doing with China, it's just part of the China fantasy. What you're doing is basically to enhance the one-party dictatorship in China, the one-party state, because all this is happening in the past 30 years. All the international engagement is somehow, at the end of the day, has not moved China into a democracy. So all what you're doing and others is part of the fantasy that actually China has no change. How do you respond, from your experience, to that kind of proposition? Thanks.
Well, I think I tell stories. And I think that you need to bring things back to the human element and to people and what people are doing, and to the extent that you can express something of stories of what people in China are doing and changes that have been made in China, I think it's fairly effective. Whether it's going to be effective on top leadership is a whole separate question. But I think in general that the people I've talked to in the energy community or in the academic community are very interested in the kinds of changes I've seen in China, even though I am not a China expert by any means. And I think they respond well to those kinds of stories about how things have changed in specifics, as opposed to just statistics or just arm waving. I think the statistics are helpful, but I think some stories with the combination.
Hi. You mentioned earlier in your comments that the motivations were important, and that China's decision makers weren't particularly concerned with the impacts of climate change vis-a-vis water pollution and local air pollution. And I was wondering if that has at all changed with the last IPCC report, with the impacts that show severe and costly impacts in the not too distant future, especially in coastal China.
I frankly don't know whether I think still the leader of any country, or the leadership in any country, has to be concerned about the things the people in that country are concerned about. And if you're facing health hazards every day, and that is a major issue, that's going to be a high priority on your list. China, of course, is one of the, if not the oldest civilizations in the world, and wants to come back into a position of major leadership in the world. I think sometimes that if they still shake their heads and are not sure why they aren't there now. In order to be a world leader, economically, but also in other ways, requires China to respond to issues the rest of the world is responding to. And I think it's also, there's a certainly a desire to be modern and to be implementing programs or policies that other developed nations have done. So China is not looked on as being backward, but is looked on as being forward and moving forward. So there's lots of psychological things that come in. To some extent, it doesn't matter what the ultimate motivation is. If they're moving in the right direction, if they're moving in the direction that will achieve environmental benefits of the kinds we've been talking about in a reasonable time frame, I'm not sure it matters what the initial motivation was, but I think the fact that we can achieve many of these multiple goals through climate change types of activities, greenhouse gas reduction activities, is important, because then it allows the leadership to address several things at the same time. Another one I didn't mention was development of the western region of China. That's been an extremely important issue to the Chinese government. It happens that the autonomous regions of China have some good renewable resources, and this is a potential to develop those resources and also the economic development of those rural regions that have been very difficult to get developed otherwise. So it's not something that's really easily answered in my view. There's multiple things at work, psychological and political, as well as the actual economics and environmental statistics, and they all come to one place. But I think at this point, China gains international respect and status by addressing climate change, and whether climate change is the reason they're doing these things or whether it is just a tool for addressing other things, I don't know that matters.
In the back. I have to be the last one.
Similar to the two previous gentlemen's questions, you mentioned that you were really happy with the legal counsel's beefing up of the enforcement laws. But it seems that, especially in a lot of publications in the States, that, especially very prominently in the New York Times, they have this serial called Choking on Growth, which seems to be telling a different story about how China is turning a blind eye, like when they kind of suggest very advantageously turning a blind eye towards these abuses. So would you call their outlook somewhat short-sighted or just uninformed?
I wouldn't. And when did you quit beating your wife? I wouldn't call it either. China is coming from a completely different legal tradition than we have in the West, and civil law is not something that was traditional in China until recently, and often it was a more violent response. So you let things go and you let things go until they get so bad, then you finally need to find somebody and make an example of them and, do something rash that sets an example, and then everybody else jumps back a bit. The fact that they put real penalties, financial penalties in the law, I think is an excellent sign because this hasn't been traditional in most Chinese laws, of actually putting in and saying, failure to comply and identifying who it is that has to comply can result in penalties of at least equivalent to the cost of compliance or double the cost of compliance. That is a big deal, I think. I think it's important that it was in the law. I think it was important, and as I talked to Chinese legislators, they felt this was taking a different approach than they had done before, and that it was important. So if you're looking backward, China has often had very ambitious goals and hasn't met them, and then they do another ambitious goal and they don't meet it, or they ignore things that they said they would do. But I think we need to look forward, and I am not an attorney, but for those of you who have studied law or are in law, this is a really recent development in China to have civil law to look at penalties rather than incarceration or something more severe as a way of responding to noncompliance and having this built in to things so that there's an economic incentive to do what's asked. So I think it was important. How strongly it'll be enforced, we'll have to see, but it's an excellent first step because this hasn't been the tradition.
Great. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Jan Hamrin for helping us end what's been a very rich and insightful day on an upbeat note, surprisingly upbeat note. Thank you very much. And thank all of you.